Hello again, Year 5, Ziggy and I here to read you chapter 17 of Tom's Midnight Garden. Hope you're comfortable. In Search of Hattie. At the end of his first frenzy of battery upon the outside of the garden door, Tom leaned against it, sobbing for breath. From inside he heard the grandfather clock coolly striking the hour, and a distant upstairs noise of voices and hurried feet. He could not open the door, and, he now realised, he had exhausted the strength of body and will that might have carried him through it. He was shut out from Hattie, and he was also shut out from his own bed in the Kitsons' flat. But the fear for Hattie remained greater than the fear for himself. Tom withdrew across the lawn into one of the yew alcoves. All he could do was wait. Is this boring you? No, I think he's just relaxing and enjoying it. It seemed a long time before the garden door opened and Abel walked out. Tom went across to him at once and addressed him. "Abel, please, how is Hattie?" Tom thought that he had prepared himself for anything from Abel. If Abel believed him to be a demon from hell, disguised as a boy and intent upon bringing misfortune to Hattie, if he believed that, then he would hate Tom and rail against him, cursing him and banning him with exorcism of prayers and the Bible. The one thing that Tom had not been prepared for was that Abel should go back to his safeguard of refusing to see or hear Tom at all. "Abel, Abel, Abel," Tom begged. "She's not dead, is she? She's not dead?" At last he saw Abel's eyelids flicker, and that for a moment he allowed himself to see Tom. Tom's face had the dirt of tree climbing upon it, and two clean tracks through the dirt from eyes to chin, where tears of exhaustion and terror had made their way. Altogether there was something about Tom so like a boy and so unlike a demon that Abel was trapped, for the last time, into speaking directly to him. "No," said Abel, "she's alive." And he fixed his eyes straight ahead again, took a deep breath, and walked deliberately through the side of Tom's body and on towards the potting shed. Ziggy's giving himself a bath, I think. Abel had left the garden door open behind him, as it always stood in these days of summer. Tom's thought was at once to go into the house again, though whether to get himself to bed or to find out more about Hattie, he did not think out. The matter was settled for him. This time, the furniture did not dissolve in front of him as he advanced up the hall. The stuffed creatures held their ground and stared at him firmly with their glass eyes through the glass sides of their cases. He had time to notice the mercury in the barometer and to see that it had reached to very dry. He saw everything clear and solid as he passed it. He came to the grandfather clock. He saw that its fingers were pointing to 11 minutes to 5, and saw again the design behind the fingers. Even in his anxiety for Hattie, his attention was arrested by it. There was nothing new to be seen, and yet he seemed to be seeing everything freshly. He still did not know who or what was the angel creature painted behind there, striding on sea and land with open book, but he felt that he almost knew the meaning. One day soon he might know. Now he turned from the grandfather clock and towards the staircase. He saw it carpeted. Each carpet tread was held in place by a shining brass rod, and tread by tread the carpet mounted softly and steadily upstairs. Tom took a step towards the staircase and then halted, wondering at what he was about to do. Behind him he was leaving that garden kingdom of Hattie's, where he and Hattie and Abel were the only 3 inhabitants, and Abel had even denied that there were more than 2. He was leaving that and going forward into the Melbournes' house. Already the Melbournes and their lives seemed to be pressing round upon him. At the foot of the stairs to the right was a row of pegs from which hung Melbourne hats and caps and coats and capes. Next to these was a boot cupboard. Tom knew it was a boot cupboard because the door was ajar and he could see the shelves inside, and standing upon them, all the Melbourne boots and shoes and slippers and pumps and gaiters and waders and spats. Opposite the coat pegs, on Tom's left, was another of the brackets, and on it had been left 2 marbly-backed ledgers, and a little safety inkwell, and an old-fashioned round ruler of ebony. Which Melbourne did they belong to? There was a door next to the bracket, the door through which Susan had once come with her kindling wood and matches. Now, from the other side of it, Tom heard a murmur of women's voices. He couldn't hear what they were saying. He couldn't hear who they were, although he imagined that one sounded like Susan's. Tom felt among many strangers and lonely. There was no Hattie here, and his secret fear was that there might be no Hattie anywhere. Abel had said, "She's alive," but perhaps that just meant she's just alive, or even she's alive but can't live long. In the past, Tom had managed to convince himself that Hattie was a ghost, and now he must face what went with that. That, at some time, she must have died. Ghosts had always died before they became so. Tom's reasoning ran in anxious, confused circles. He needed a great deal of courage to go forward and set his foot on the bottom step of that soft, silent stair. Perhaps, although Tom could be very brave, perhaps he would have lacked the last touch of courage, but for the sound of the grandfather clock behind him. Its ticking sounded to him like a human heart, alive and beating, and he thought of Hattie when he thought of that. He braced himself and began going upstairs. When he reached the upstairs landing, he was in part of the Melbourne's house that he had never seen before. So it seemed to Tom. He had forgotten that this house was, too, the house in which somehow his aunt and uncle, as well as other tenants, lived. There was not very much to remind him of that now. The first-floor landing of the Melbourne's house was carpeted, and wider than the corridor between the flats that Tom knew, and there were many doors off it, each leading to a bedroom, instead of 2 doors only, which were the front doors of 2 flats. The little stairway that had simply gone up to Mrs. Bartholomew's front door now ended in a tiny landing with 3 doors off it. Tom surveyed the first landing. Every door was shut, so there were 3 doors on the attic floor. Behind which of all these doors did Hattie lie? There was really no clue, so Tom chose the nearest door on the first landing. He took a deep breath, concentrated, tensed his muscles, and drove his head steadily through the woodwork and into the room on the other side. Hattie was not in this bedroom. The dust sheets over the bed and over the other furniture showed it to be a spare room. Can you hear something? Or do you think it's Hattie? I wonder. I've completely lost my place now. Sorry. Give me a moment. Showed it to be a spare room. Its windows looked over the garden. Tom could see... Oh, hi, Ziggs. Tom could see, even from his position over the door, the tops of the yew trees opposite, and the great height of the ivied fir unfallen. He was looking only for Hattie. He did not linger over this view, but later he had cause to remember it. He wrenched his head back through the door again and considered what to do next. He had intended to push his head through each door in turn until he found Hattie, but now he wondered whether that method would be wise. Already he was tiring, and his ears were singing and his eyes aching, and even his stomach, which had remained on the safe side of the door, was heaving a little. If Hattie were behind the last door he came to try, he might never be able to reach her. Surely, in these special circumstances, dishonest methods were excusable. Tom began to peep through keyholes, and to listen at them. Through the 3rd keyhole he heard something, a very soft, rhythmic swishing sound. He could not think what made it, and the keyhole view showed him only a washstand with basin and ewer, a length of lace curtain draped over part of the window, and a very upright chair. No, he could not imagine what the noise could be. Surely, at least, it could not be coming from Hattie lying ill, perhaps dying. The thought of her thus made him turn desperately on to try the other doors, and then again, even as he turned, he thought that perhaps Hattie was lying in that room after all, but delirious, no sound or motion except for her hands that ceaselessly and softly stroked down the sheet of her bed. Swish, swish, swish. Tom turned back to the door from behind which that sound came, and began fairly to ram his head through it. He was up to his eyebrows in the woodwork when he heard, his ears were still free, a step on the stairs behind him. Tom had a horror of being caught part way through a door. He pulled back and faced about quickly. A man was coming upstairs. He carried under one arm the office ledgers that Tom had noticed in the hall below. He held the inkwell and ruler in his hand. He had the grave look of someone who earns his living and has just finished earning it for the day. Who was he? A Melbourne? Tom was sure. Those were Melbourne features. The man came directly along the landing, directly towards Tom, but he had no concern with Tom after all. He stopped by the very door that Tom had been trying and knocked gently. "Mother?" The swishing sound stopped. A voice that Tom recognised at once as Hattie's aunt said, "Who is that?" "James." James? Tom was startled. James had only been a youth when Tom had last seen him in the garden. Had so much of Melbourne time passed in so little of Tom's time that James had grown into a man, and a businessman at that. Hello, Ziggy, come back to us. Here he certainly was, broad and tall and strong, with a high, shiny collar and that face of gravity above it. "You can come in," said the woman's voice. "I'm only brushing my hair." James went in and Tom went with him. He had not meant to, for he was not an inquisitive, impertinent boy, but James's question, even as he opened the door, was, "How is Hattie?" They both stood inside the bedroom door, the man and the boy. Once James looked round him uneasily, as people will who know they are alone and yet guess at some other presence in the room, a cat's perhaps. In front of her dressing-table mirror stood Hattie's aunt. Her long brown hair fell heavily as low as to her waist, and she was passing her hairbrush down from scalp to tips, with that steady swishing sound. Tom saw as he watched that the hair was not at all brown now, but greying. Time had passed too for Hattie's aunt. She was not answering James at once. She stopped brushing her hair and began twisting it and braiding it. As she did so, she said casually and coldly, "Hattie will do well enough." "Is that what the doctor says?" "Yes." "Well, we must be thankful then." "Thankful?" With her hands still in her hair, Hattie's aunt turned to face her son. "Thankful? But what was she doing to have the accident? Climbing trees, if you please. Has she no sense of what is fitting to her sex and to her age now? She's old enough to know better." "Hattie's young for her age," said James. "Perhaps it comes from her being by herself so much, playing alone, always in the garden." "Oh, you were always kind to her," cried Hattie's aunt, and she made what she said sound like a bitter accusation. "And so she is never to grow up? What is to happen to her if so? I don't know. She's a strange enough girl as it is." Hattie's aunt had turned back to her mirror to arrange the braidings of her hair. "Of course Hattie will grow up," said James, and Tom admired the way in which he stood up to his mother's anger. "But what's to become of her then?" "She's not to expect anything more from me, surely. I've given her charity enough." "In that case, mother, she will have to earn her own living somehow. Although how she is to do that, I don't know. Or perhaps she will marry, although, again, she knows no one and meets no one outside this house and garden. I will not have her ruling in this house when I am gone." Hattie's aunt had not turned from the mirror, but was staring intently into it, at the image of her son reflected there. "What do you mean, mother?" "You and Hubert and Edgar are all grown now, and in your father's business, and independent as far as that goes. Very well. But if any of you thinks later of marrying Harriet, do not expect ever to have a penny from me. Hubert has never cared for the girl, and I believe Edgar dislikes her, but you have pitied her." In the silence after this, Tom rather expected James, who was so bold, to cry out that he had not thought before of marrying Hattie. But now he saw what a good idea it was, and he certainly would marry her as soon as she was of age, and they would be rich and live happily ever after, all in spite of his mother. But James was not romantic. He gave a little sigh. "I had no intention of ever marrying Hattie. I don't suppose that I ever shall have. But she is certainly to be pitied." "She is pitiable, certainly," said Hattie's aunt grimly. "And surely, mother, now she's growing up, she should see more of the world than this house and this garden can show her. She should meet more people. She should make acquaintances. She should make friends. You know perfectly well that she loves only to be alone in the garden." We can draw her from that. We have friends, and she must not be allowed to always hide away from them, as if she were afraid. When we make parties up, she can be made to want to join them. Boating on the river and picnics, cricket matches to watch, whist drives, carol singing at Christmas, skating. She doesn't want to grow up. She wants only her garden. We could make her want more. I'll go to her now and talk to her and say that, when she is quite well again. She must go in for a gayer life. I'll say that we want her to go out, to make friends. We all, Tom? Watching the woman's face in the glass, Tom saw a cold disagreement in it. Can I say that you wish it, Mother? You will waste your pity and your breath with Harriet. Can I at least say that you agree? You can say what you like to her. You can do what you like with her, and the less I see of her, the better. She turned her head so that she saw her son neither in reflection nor in the flesh. James withdrew and Tom with him. James went to a door at the end of the landing, knocked softly and entered. Tom waited outside until the interview with Hattie should be over. He listened to the rise and fall of James's voice as he talked. He spoke gently, as though to someone who was ill or had been so, but he spoke at great length. And Tom thought that Hattie's injury could not have been as serious as he had feared, if she could listen to all that James had to tell her. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll move this around so you can see